Incredibly lucky here in Devon to live in such a beautiful part of the world. And there's no better way to witness that than to stand here on our newest nature reserve, Idford Common on the Haldon Ridge, and look southwest over the rolling hills towards Dartmoor in the distance. And we have this fantastic habitat all over our county, whether it's these internationally important mires and our national parks, our many spectacular rivers and their estuaries, or these really stunning reefs that surround our coastline. But nature's in trouble. We know nature's in trouble for all sorts of reasons. It's in trouble because of climate change. It's in trouble because of pollution. But more than any other single thing, it's in trouble because we simply haven't allowed enough space for it to thrive. Too much of Devon currently looks like this. And however pretty this may seem, it's very hard to see how any species can thrive in a landscape that looks like this one. Not only have we left little space for it to thrive, but sadly, considerable amount of habitat that has left gets damaged or destroyed each year. So this is Coombe grassland here, one of our most important habitats, something of a Devon speciality. And you can see areas that have been lost because they've been ploughed up, because they've been planted up the Sitka spruce, or simply because they have been neglected. And this is a trend that continues year on year. And this loss of habitat is having a huge impact on many species. So we know here in Devon and across the UK that 1 in 7 species are at risk of extinction, more than 50% are in decline. Now, these broad figures sometimes hide important details. So if we look at particular groups of plants and animals like these insects, it's a very different story. So our insects, the bedrock of all life on land, are declining at 8 times the rate of more familiar groups like plants and animals. So we need to do a whole lot better. We need to raise our game. We need to look to the skies, think big and long term. Now, most scientists believe that we need at least 30% or about a third of our land and our seas to be protected for wildlife if we're going to stem the loss that we're currently seeing, let alone turn the tide. Now, this is the sort of target that you would imagine that today's politicians would scoff at. But actually, surprisingly and encouragingly, our Prime Minister recently committed to do just this, to protect 30% of our land for wildlife. Now, the trouble is, it all depends what you define or how you define that 30%. And our Prime Minister used as his starting point the designated landscapes of national parks and area of outstanding natural beauty. And he argued that with 26% of the UK is covered by these, or England anyway is covered by these, and so we just needed another 4% to get to that magic 30%. Now in Devon, we're very well blessed with these protected landscapes. You've got 2 national parks in Exmoor and Dartmoor. We've got 5 areas of outstanding natural beauty. And we have some other designations as well, which aren't shown on this map. And you could argue that we're already ahead of that 30%. But the trouble is these are landscape designations. They are not wildlife designations. Now this slide here shows Exmoor, and it's very, very beautiful view it is indeed. But apart from a few bits you can see in the foreground, most of that landscape there is actually quite hostile to wildlife. It's intensively farmed, and it's not much better than most of the land outside the national park. So if you take this into account, we're nowhere near 30%. We are at very best at 15% coverage of good quality wildlife habitat here in Devon. And that's why I believe we need to double it to get from 15% to 30% in 10 years. Now, this is a big, bold challenge. It requires us to think and act at a far greater scale than we've ever done before. And it poses a number of questions. The first question is, where do we put all this new habitat? Because we can't just stick it down in one block. Now, this map here shows the habitat that we currently have in Devon. It's not all protected, it's not all in good condition, but this is the habitat that we've currently got mapped. And you can see that there are some quite big parcels, so 2 or 3 here on Dartmoor, and then some others which are around our river estuaries. But most of this habitat is scattered in tiny fragments around the countryside. And this is quite a big problem because you get small areas like this. This is an aerial view of one of our smallest reserves, Swanpool Marsh. This is in Braunton up in the north of the county. It's a few acres in size only, but you can see that it's surrounded by not very friendly land for wildlife. So you've got the built up development in the north east, and otherwise it's surrounded by very intensively farmed land. This is of course a fragment of what used to cover much of this landscape. And because it's this small fragment surrounded by this wildlife hostile landscape, it's very difficult for species to get in and out of this reserve. And that means that over time we tend to see smaller numbers of species and smaller numbers of individuals of those species. And this is a real problem as well, because rare plants like this one and marsh cinquefoil and many others, insects and birds, rely on these areas to breed. So if these are no longer good for wildlife, we will lose these species over time. So we need a grand plan. We need a blueprint that shows how we can not only increase the size of these sites, but we need to show how we can link them all together. And that blueprint is the Nature Recovery Network. Now, you'll have heard, I'm sure, mention of the Nature Recovery Network before. I've certainly mentioned it at previous AGMs. We're still in the process of building ours here in Devon. But this is a county that is slightly ahead of us. This is the former county of Avon, where the West of England Partnership have produced the Nature Recovery Network, or at least the first draft of it. It's not on the ground yet. This is only a map, of course, but this is giving an idea of what it might look like. And what you can see here is various different shades. So the dark shade is showing the habitat that they've already got here, either the grassland or the woodland or the mires, the wetlands. And the lighter colour shade is where the map is assuming that these bits of habitat would expand and join together. So join together and connect up along ridges, along river valleys, along the coast, and in any other way possible, so that you can see over time you get this coverage, really impressive coverage of habitat right the way across the landscape. There are no significant white areas of no wildlife in it. And that's what we're going to be aiming for in Devon. Now, maps are great, of course, but maps are just maps. Maps aren't reality. So how do we make this happen? Well, a number of things. The first, I think, is we need big, bold, ambitious projects on the ground. Now, this is the Great Fen Project, and this is in East Anglia, and it's in one of the most intensively farmed areas in Europe. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here, this is what the fields look like when they're farmed. This really dark soil. Incredibly intensive, hardly a hedge or anything in sight. Yet on the other side, you see this extraordinary landscape that's starting to recover. And this landscape you see did look like the landscape on the right until a few years ago. So it's amazing what nature can do. So this is the Great Fen Project. Why in Devon can't we have the Great Atlantic Oak Project? Why can't we have the Great Dartmoor Mire Project, the Great Coastal Marsh Project? There's no reason why we shouldn't have them. And there's every reason why Devon Wildlife Trust perhaps should be leading them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we need these small areas, these networks rather, that link these small areas together right across the landscape. So we need to be looking at corridors along rivers, along footpaths, along our roads, and crucially in and out of farmland. And if every farmer put 5% of his or her land into habitat like this, verges on the edge of fields, perhaps letting the hedges grow out a bit, what an enormous difference that would make. This is often the least productive farmland anyway in a field, because it's shaded out by the hedge. So why can't we aim for that? Massive difference that would make. Then I think we need to look at bringing wildlife back on a grand scale to our towns and cities. Now, we're already starting to do this a little bit through projects like Exeter Wild City in Exeter and Green Mines in Plymouth. But this is a city that's really taken wildlife to its heart. So this is Liverpool, and these are former areas, or this is an example of a former industrial area, which has been guerrilla sown with wildflower seeds and has this quite incredible impact on the landscape in the city. So let's have this sort of thing here in Devon and in other cities too. And if we want to think really grand, we can look abroad. So this is Stockholm. This is a city of 1 million people, 4 times the size of Plymouth, 8 times the size of Exeter. And yet 30% of this city is high quality green space, great for wildlife, great for people. Let's have that, please, in England too. No reason why we shouldn't. And then the final thing, I think, is to let go of control and to start bringing back some of what's been lost. Now, we've already done this a bit with the beavers, of course, made a great start with that, but there's many other species as well, which we could bring back. But it's not just about reintroducing species, it's about letting nature run itself. We're very used to controlling everything here in the UK. We don't necessarily need to. You only need to go to a place like Meath. I was there last week. That reminds me how stunning it is. This was once a really bad industrial scar 20 years ago, and yet leave nature on its own and it will heal. It will heal incredibly effectively, incredibly efficiently, and it will do it for no charge whatsoever. So what can we then do as individuals to make all this happen? Well, there's lots of things we can do, but I would just pull out three. I think the first is to look at our own personal spaces. So many of us are lucky enough to have gardens, and gardens can seem very small and insignificant. But if you take the combined area of all our gardens in the country, it's an area several times the size of Dartmoor National Park. So it's very significant. But so many of our gardens at the moment are very closely mown. We put all sorts of chemicals on the grass to make it all look green. And no, let's say no to all that. We don't want that. What we want is long grass. We want rough edges. We want garden ponds. We want hibernaculum, areas for we want messy patches, areas for bugs and beasts to overwinter, all this kind of thing. That's what makes a really interesting garden. If we can all do that, wow, what a difference would that make? The second thing I think we can do is get involved with our communities and get a sense of vision for our local areas, whether that's a parish or a community area within a city. So this is a group here which are surveying the community, looking at the hedges and the fields and the verges and the trees and the village greens and all these important spaces. And if these groups can have a vision for what's happening to a field, persuade farmers perhaps to do something different with one or two of their fields, look at the mowing regime of the verges and the public open spaces, look at the flailing regimes, the cutting regimes of the hedges, that can make an enormous difference. And maps produced by an organisation like the Devon Wildlife Trust across the whole of Devon are very powerful. But maps owned by the local community with a real sense of purpose are even more effective. Think what could happen if every parish, every community across Devon did this. And finally, I'm slightly embarrassed to say this yet again, but finally, yes, we need to lobby our politicians. This must be the third AGM in a row where I have raised the point of the Environment Bill, but would you believe it is coming back to government yet again for the third and probably final time. In early December, we're going to have a final chance to get the Environment Bill right. Now, the government at the moment is a little bit schizophrenic towards the environment, has to be said. So it makes some positive noises. It obviously talked about the 30%, which is great, even if we don't quite agree on how we interpret that. It's got a 25-year environment plan, which is tremendous, first we've had in a long time. But it's also coming up with statements like build, build, build. And at the top of this slide here, you can see a wonderful looking tree. This is a champion pear tree in Warwickshire. I'm afraid a couple of weeks ago, that was cut down, and it was cut down to make way for HS2. The government needs to decide, and we need to help it decide, whether it puts wildlife or development first. For far too long, development has always trumped wildlife. And I think, and I'm sure you will agree, that it's high time that we turn that around.